conversation on Twitter at VO Israel, Voice of Israel on Facebook, and of course our website voiceofisrael.com. In studio is Hadar Sella, the managing editor of BBC Watch. BBC Watch, their modus operandi, if you will, is to monitor BBC coverage of Israel for accuracy and impartiality. She has a special interest in the influence of the media on the British public's perceptions of the Middle East and the Islamist networks operating in the UK. We've had her on the phone. Now we have her here in person, and it's an honor. Hadar Sella, welcome to the Josh Hasten Show, Voice of Israel.
Thank you, Josh. Lovely to be here.
So, a difficult week here in the Jewish world. Unfortunately, we have too many difficult weeks with terrorism in Europe, terrorism in this part of the world as well. But I want to focus on the media coverage. You focus exclusively, if I understand right, on the BBC, the most prominent, the largest. I mean, prominent, I guess, is a relative term. The largest media network in England, covering world news. Tell us the latest. What's going on in terms of the way the BBC is covering Israel in terms of current events? What's happening now in our world?
Well, the BBC, of course, isn't just the largest broadcaster in England. It's the largest broadcaster in the world, in fact, and the most influential. And that's why the BBC is so important. We've seen the recent attacks in Copenhagen. We've seen the ones before in France, in Paris, the Charlie Hebdo attacks. But of course, it didn't start there. It's a problem in Europe, the anti-Semitism that's been going on for a very, very long time. The British organisation, the CST, the Community Security Trust, which takes care of security for British Jews in the UK, recently put out a report and explained that, in fact, this was the worst year on record so far for anti-Semitism. And, of course, a lot of that was due to the events of the summer, the events we had here in Israel in the summer, the Operation Protective Edge, and the coverage of that operation definitely affects events in Europe. The all-party group on anti-Semitism in the UK, in the British Parliament, has also recently put out a report. And in that report, too, the BBC is cited. They say BBC coverage, the volume, just the sheer volume of BBC coverage, distorted people's picture of what was going on in the Middle East. So it obviously has a very, very important effect. And we're actually just in the final stages of organising a conference on that subject. It'll be here in Jerusalem on March 1st in the evening, 7 o'clock in the evening. And we'll be discussing how UK media coverage affects, how the coverage of UK media outlets of events here in Israel affects anti-Semitism in Britain. We can see a definite link. You can come along and join the conversation with us. It's at the Agron Guest House, and you can find the link to register on our website, which is bbcwatch.org.
Watch.org. And I want to talk more about the conference, but ironically, the things that you were saying in terms of the coverage of Israel, the amount of coverage of Israel, gives the possibility that the BBC and, of course, others can skew the coverage based on the sheer volume. And it's ironic to me how in several different instances that I'm thinking of just off the top of my head, you had the woman who was interviewed at the funeral for the Jewish victims there in Paris.
At the march.
Yeah, how
yes.
she was put on the spot, and
yes.
essentially, the way Israel treats the Arabs in this region was to blame for that attack. And then you had it again with a leading rabbi, I believe. I think this was actually Sky. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Sky,
Sky,
yes.
Also, essentially accusing or blaming the anti-Semitism on Israel's policies, etc. I want you to comment on that. It's ironic because, on one hand, we are here saying that it's because of that sheer volume and the way things are skewed. That's the real reason that these incidents happen. And the BBC themselves aren't of course not blaming themselves, not looking in the mirror. They're blaming Israel for those incidents. I want you to comment on that, please.
I monitored very closely the entire coverage put out by the BBC during July and August this year, during the time of the Operation Protective Edge. viewers of BBC television actually saw nearly 3 times more filmed coverage from the Gaza Strip than they did from Israel. The last 2 weeks of the war, it was as if nothing had happened in Israel at all. There was very little coverage of the missile attacks here. There was very little coverage of what happened here. It was very one-sided coverage. You would think there was only something going on in Gaza. And since then, they're calling it the Gaza War. It's not the war that took place in Israel and Gaza. It's the Gaza War. You wouldn't know anything had happened in this country at all. So that obviously affects the way people see things. The event in Paris, where, just to recap for listeners, a BBC reporter was interviewing a lady who'd come to the march to show solidarity after the attacks on Charlie Hebdo and on the Hyper supermarket. And the lady was talking about the fears of the Jewish community in Paris, and the BBC reporter actually said to her, "Well, some people would say it's because of what happens in the no. Actually, he did say some people would say that Palestinians have suffered at Jewish hands, not even Israeli, Jewish hands. That's a very significant point, and it's actually an anti-Semitic statement. To blame Jews abroad for things that happened in Israel is according to the EUMC definition of anti-Semitism." It's anti-Semitism. There's been a lot of noise about that. There were a lot of complaints made to the BBC. The issue is currently under review. We're expecting an answer on the 28th of February, if I'm not mistaken. It will be interesting to see how the BBC reacts to that, because it was a very clear-cut case of anti-Semitism in a BBC broadcast, and of course, people were very upset by it.
And then there was another reporter, correct me or refresh my memory, who sent out a Twitter message. Was it Wilcox was his name, a reporter there from the BBC? Also, he said some controversial statements, tying in Israel. Do you know what I'm referring to there?
No.
So I'll have to go back and take a look at that. But in addition to the issue of volume in terms of the coverage of Israel, what about the actual content itself in terms of it being skewed? I've actually taken a reporter from the BBC back when we had Gush Katif in 2003, before the so-called disengagement, and she was telling me, and I don't know if things have changed. You tell me. She said, well, the Arabs, the Palestinians, actually say that it's the other way around, that the coverage is slanted pro-Israel. What would you say to that? And those are some of the complaints that the BBC apparently gets, that the coverage is too pro-Israel. What would you say?
They do get such complaints, and at least part of the time, some of those complaints are actually part of a political campaigning rather than genuine complaints. There's an organisation in the UK called the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which we can pretty much be honest and say makes the BBC's life a misery. And a lot of it's from a political motivation rather than actual dealing with the journalistic side of things. But I think if you look at coverage, there are certain signposts. For instance, you will not see the BBC using the word terrorist when it talks about Israel. They never, ever use the word terrorist. It might be a gunman, it might be a militant. The attacks we had last November, there were these mysterious cars all on their own crashing into people in Jerusalem. There was no use of the word terrorist at all. It's another area I've studied quite a lot. In Northern Ireland, they do use the word terrorist. The shootings in Norway, the Andreas Breivik shootings, they do call them terrorism. Attacks against, there was an attack in Mali, I think, against some oil people a few years ago. That was terrorism. So there are places where there is terrorism, and there are places where there aren't. And of course, that's politically motivated. It depends on your politics, what you choose to call terrorism and what you don't.
So tell me, what you do in BBC Watch in terms of encouraging people to take action? What are some of the things you do? There are several organizations that deal with different elements in the media, different, they focus on different media outlets. What is BBC Watch? What is your mandate in terms of encouraging people to hold the BBC accountable for this skewed coverage?
So on our website, we highlight problematic reports from the BBC. We try very much to provide the facts that are very often missing so that people are aware of the whole story and of the facts, and they can use that in making their own complaints. The BBC has a very specific complaint system. It's not like other media outlets where you can just write a letter and get an answer. They have a very long, complicated, labyrinthine complaint system that you had to be pretty brave to even embark on in the first place. But people who do get results, we get corrections. Things are changed, not always with credit, but they change sometimes. And the idea is to empower the general public, to provide them with the information they need, so they can make their own complaints and make a difference.
Our time is short. We only have about another minute or so. Again, tell us about the March 1st event. How can people find out more about it and the crux of the event itself before we have to go?
Yeah, you can see it on our website on bbcwatch.org. There's a button on the side, give you all the details of the event. Our keynote speaker is Professor Robert Wistrich from the Hebrew University, the head of the Vidal Sassoon Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. And we have Lucille Cohen, who was head of the Jewish community in Manchester for many, many years. Myself and my colleague Adam Levick, who is launching a new website called UK Media Watch. I do the BBC, he'll be doing the rest. And we hope to have a really interesting discussion, and please come along.
So I'll bring my complaints about Sky News to him then.
You will, yes.
Hadar Sella, managing editor of BBC Watch, monitoring the BBC's coverage of Israel. I want to thank you so much for your time. Thank you that you came in studio today. It was a pleasure and an honor having you here face-to-face in studio. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Lovely to be here.
This is Josh Haston, Voice of Israel. We just have a few seconds left. Just to give you an update, I'm going to be ranting after the bottom of the hour news. I still have a lot to